They whisper about her still, in taverns, behind locked doors, through cracked lips before sleep takes them. They speak of blood, but they never speak of silk. They forget the quiet. The way her bare feet would cross the marble at dusk, soundless, except for the soft hush of skin on stone. The way the firelight clung to her like a lover, warming lace that had no right to touch her skin. They forget how she smiled, not like a woman, but like a secret. I was there, not as a knight, nor as a priest, but as something far more dangerous. The one who watched her undress and lived to remember. They call her monster, witch, but monsters don't hum lullabies to dying girls. Witches don't weep over bruises on their own wrists. No, only a woman does that. A woman made of night, perfume, and longing. They call her Countess. I never dared call her anything at all. I just listened and obeyed. And now, after all these years, I wonder, did I serve her or did I love her?
The first time I saw her undress, it was not meant for me. She stood with her back to the fire, half in shadow, half wrapped in steam from the copper tub. The air smelled of lavender and something sweeter, something faintly metallic, like coins left too long in a warm hand. Her maid had been dismissed. The door hadn't quite shut. I hadn't quite left. Was it wrong to linger where I shouldn't? To watch, silent, as she slid one sleeve from her shoulder and then the other, letting the silk fall like a sigh onto the stone floor. I told myself I stayed because I feared for her safety, but that was a lie, and she knew it. Because the next night she left the door open again. It was December 1610. Snow clung to the narrow windows like pale hands pressed from the outside. The castle groaned in its sleep, stones settling into cold. But her room was always warm, always scented, always forbidden. I never saw her harm anyone, not with my own eyes. Only whispers, stains, and the way some girls would leave her chambers trembling, not from pain, but from something deeper, something that left them too quiet for days. They say she bathed in blood, but I only ever saw her bathed in candlelight. I remember the curve of her neck as she leaned forward, brushing out her hair, the way the fire turned the strands to copper and gold. She never asked me to speak, only to listen. "She hear them talk about me," she said once, voice low, eyes on her own reflection in the silver mirror. "But none of them come close, do they?" "No, my lady. None of them ever did." Sometimes she would press a finger to her lips and beckon me closer, not to touch, just to see, to know what they didn't, to hold her secrets between my ribs like a second heartbeat. I should have told someone. I should have turned away. But how do you walk from a woman like that? She didn't need chains to keep you. Just the way she looked over her shoulder, like she already knew what you dreamed of. They say she killed dozens, hundreds even. But I remember her tears, soft, silent, slipping down a cheek no blade had ever touched. Perhaps she did terrible things. Perhaps I helped her do them. But when I close my eyes now, old and alone, I don't see corpses. I see silk, smoke, and the red mark she once left on my wrist when she whispered, "Stay." And I did.
They said the castle had more than 100 rooms, but only 3 mattered. The bedchamber, where she slept alone. The bath, where she never let the maids stay longer than a minute. And the third, the one without a name. It sat at the end of the east wing. No door handle, no keyhole, just the heavy wooden panel carved with symbols I never asked about. She called it the quiet room. No light but candle, no sound but breath. She asked me to prepare it one evening. The snow outside was thick. The windows had iced over from the inside, and yet the fire in that room was always lit, even before I arrived. She stepped in without a word. Her gown trailed behind her like fog. Not a speck of dust dared follow her. I had placed a velvet chair by the hearth, just as she preferred. She sat slowly, one leg crossing the other, gloved hand resting lightly on her lap. She didn't look at me, not at first. Only when I began to leave did her voice stop me. "You never ask me what this room is for," she said. I paused, not because I had an answer, but because the sound of her voice, low, measured, filled the room like perfume in warm air. "It's not curiosity that keeps you here, is it?" she asked. "It's something else." I didn't respond. She wouldn't have wanted me to. Instead, she stood, slowly, gracefully, and walked toward me. Her steps made no sound, only the rustle of fabric and the faint pull of breath between us. "I could tell you everything," she whispered, "but you wouldn't believe it." She reached out, brushed something from my shoulder, dust perhaps, or nothing at all. Her fingers lingered, not possessive, not tender, simply present. "You listen better than any man I've ever known," she murmured, "and you never look away." I swallowed hard. She smiled, not cruel, not kind, just knowing. "You'll stay tonight," she said. Not a question, not a command, just a decision already made. Then she turned from me, and with one slow breath, blew out the single candle on the mantel. Darkness fell, soft and immediate. The room held its breath, and so did I. She disappeared into the shadow without another word, leaving only warmth behind and the soft echo of my heart, still beating for her.
Morning in the castle was never quiet. Servants whispered, boots clattered on stone floors, silver clinked against porcelain like tiny bells calling for grace. But when she entered, everything stopped. The Countess did not rush. She never needed to. Her presence carried the weight of centuries, and silk, always silk, followed her like a second shadow. The great hall was drenched in pale winter light that morning. Snow outside burned white against the windows, but inside, everything glowed warm, because she was there. She wore black, not for mourning, no, for command. The high collar kissed her throat, while a single pearl rested like a secret between her breasts. "Sit," she said. One word, soft, but every chair obeyed. I stood behind her, as always, hands folded, eyes lowered, pretending not to watch the curve of her wrist as she lifted a spoon to lips that could ruin men in their sleep. She didn't eat much. She never did. A sip of wine, a piece of fruit she barely touched, but the way she held that crystal goblet, as though the stem were alive, as though it should thank her for being touched, it did things to my breath. Across the table, the steward spoke of taxes. Another man spoke of soldiers. I heard nothing, because she laughed. God help me, that sound. Low, velvety, rolling from her throat like a promise no one could keep. When her eyes finally lifted, they found mine. Not for long, just long enough to pin me against the silence and peel something raw from my bones. "Fetch the letter from my chambers," she said. Her voice was silk over steel, a caress with teeth hidden inside. I bowed, turned to go, but before I could leave, she added softly, "and closed the door." The men froze. I froze. Her smile was small, sharp, and it cut through me cleaner than any blade. I walked out on legs that barely belonged to me. The hall behind me roared with voices again, but in my ears, only her laughter remained. And as I climbed the steps to her chamber, I wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if I didn't return? If I locked myself in that room instead and waited for her? But I always returned. Always. Because that's what love does. It bends. It obeys. It learns the art of silence, until silence is the only language you speak.
They said it was just a wine cellar. A new one, deeper, cooler, for the sweet tokaji she kept in crystal bottles. That's what they told the noble guests. But I was there when they laid the first stones. It wasn't wine she was building for. It was silence. It was privacy. I held the lantern the night they finished the steps. The walls still smelled of dust and lime, and she stood there, in her deep velvet cloak, looking down into the dark, as if she were greeting an old lover. She turned to me and said only this, "Tonight, you may watch." She didn't mean to follow her, not with my feet. She meant with my eyes, from above, from the slits in the ceiling carved into stone, narrow, hidden, cruelly perfect. She had designed them herself, just wide enough for a single gaze, no room for breath, no room for mercy. She walked below, slow, deliberate, trailing her fingers along the wall like she was reading a secret written just for her. And then the girl was brought in. I don't remember her name, only that she wore white, and that she looked up once, before the door closed. What I saw through the slit wasn't clear. It never is. That's the game she played. A shadow, a rustle, a shape that bent forward and did not rise again. But I heard everything. I heard the sound of silk falling to stone, the soft knock of something porcelain-tipped, and her voice, low, patient, like a lullaby in a dead language. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. I don't think the girl screamed, not loudly, only once, like someone waking from a dream they wished had lasted longer. And then it stopped, just stopped. She looked up at me later, when she stepped out from the dark and found me waiting near the stairs, holding the old basin from the physician's shelf, the one used for cleansing wounds or catching breath. I didn't know what it would be used for tonight. But she smiled, touched the rim of the basin, and said nothing. And still, I understood everything. That was the night she let me watch, and I haven't looked away since.
There was always a scent. Even before she entered the room, it lingered, like smoke from a candle no one saw extinguished. Not perfume, not entirely. More like skin warmed by velvet, a whisper of crushed rose petals, old leather, and something sharper beneath. Something I could never name. But I always knew when she was near. Her gloves were the first thing I noticed. Black, fine-stitched, always buttoned at the wrist. No matter the heat, no matter the hour. She wore them like armor. And yet, they were soft. So soft. Once I was close enough to see the imprint of her nails beneath the fabric. Short, neat, clean. But there was tension in the fingers, as if they remembered holding something tight, something that had tried to pull away. She would bring them to her face sometimes, slowly, deliberately, breathing in whatever memory they carried from the night before. And I watched her do it. I shouldn't have. But the morning light was falling through the upper hall, and she was standing by the stained glass window, head tilted, eyes closed, one gloved hand pressed gently to her lips. Not praying, not ashamed, just remembering. She turned suddenly, caught me watching, my breath caught with her eyes. But she didn't speak. She only walked closer, each step measured as if the floor answered to her weight alone. And she raised her hand, the glove, and brushed it, just once, across the side of my face. The touch was light, but the scent, it stayed. Even now, I remember it more clearly than her words. She said something after. Something about the linen deliveries, something about the bathwater not being warm enough, but none of it mattered. Because I couldn't stop thinking of what she had touched the night before, and how that scent, delicate, forbidden, impossible to wash away, had been left for me. Not by accident, not anymore. She knew. She always knew. And from that moment on, I began to wait for her gloves. Not her hands, not her voice, just the quiet trace of what they'd done and what they'd remember next.
The tub was always warm, too warm for most. She liked it that way, said it loosened the skin. The servants would carry buckets up from the kitchens, 2 at a time, bare-armed, sweating, and pour them in, one after the other, until steam wrapped the room like fog over a still lake. No one else bathed there, not even the Count, especially not him. Only her. And she never bathed alone. Not truly. She liked to be observed. There was always someone, a maid, a healer, sometimes one of us, standing just close enough to hear her sigh, but never close enough to touch. That morning it was me. She asked me to bring the lavender oil, said her muscles ached from riding the day before, but her hair was dry, and the horses hadn't left the stables since Wednesday. I didn't ask. The marble tiles were slick beneath my boots. I remember the sound, soft footsteps, the drip of water sliding from porcelain to stone, and her voice, echoing, low, amused, commanding. She had let the towels slip, her back curved forward, arms resting on the edge of the tub, steam rising around her like smoke from a sacred fire. She didn't cover herself. She never did. Not in that room, not when someone was watching. She spoke of simple things, the rose garden, the Hungarian guests expected for supper, a dress she might wear, one with silver threading and tiny pearl buttons she claimed she could undo with one hand. She said it with a smile, but her eyes stayed closed. And then she held out her hand, dripping, open, waiting. I stepped forward, unsure. The oil in my palm felt suddenly heavier. She didn't look at me, only turned her wrist slightly, offering the back of her hand, and said, "There." So I poured it, slowly, let the lavender run down her fingers, past her wrist, into the warm water, where it vanished without a sound. She exhaled, long, contented, as if something inside her had been satisfied. And then she smiled, the kind that didn't reach the corners of her mouth. She whispered, "Next time, bring the rosemary." Then she sank deeper into the water, and I stepped away, my boots leaving silent wet prints across the floor. I didn't turn back, but I smelled the lavender for hours after. And for days, I kept wondering what it would have felt like to touch her shoulder before the steam disappeared.
They came in carriages lined with fur, tall wheels creaking over the gravel, red wax seals on litters handed to the guards. Always unexpected, always welcome. She said the castle needed laughter, said noble blood must not sit still too long or it thickened like stew. And so they came, barons from Nitra, cousins from Trenchen, a widow from Bratislava with too many rings and not enough fingers, all smiling, all hungry. She hosted them like a queen. The great hall would glow, candelabras lit even at noon, platters of game and golden pears passed hand to hand. But it was never the feast they remembered. It was her. She'd move between them like mist, a finger on one shoulder, a murmur in another's ear. That glance, that scent. Always lavender or something darker. I watched them fall in love with her. It happened fast. The men offered land, the women offered secrets. Some offered more. She accepted everything, with a smile like a lock that would never turn. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. Not vanish, just remain. They'd say they were tired, that the roads were too muddy, that the horses needed rest. And suddenly, rooms once cold were occupied. Rooms at the far end of the West Wing, where the windows didn't open, where I delivered trays but no one spoke, where voices murmured at night, too soft to catch, too strange to forget. Some stayed for weeks, others months, but few left through the gate. One girl, I remember her name was Ilona, had arrived with her aunt. She laughed too loudly the first night. By the third, she was silent. I saw her once in the corridor, carrying a book upside down. And her wrists, they bore marks, thin, deliberate, like jewelry that had been too tight, or ropes that had not. I told myself not to ask. But one night, as I passed her chamber, I heard singing, low, off-key, sweet, like something from childhood, and another voice, hers, firm, repetitive. Speaking in Hungarian I barely understood, words like Maradni, stay, Engedel Skedni, obey. By morning, Ilona was gone. No carriage, no farewell, only a scent in the corridor, and a glove forgotten near the stairs. It was small, brass, hung from a velvet cord above her bed, just to the left of the canopy. Hungarian nobility in her time, especially those of the Nador class, often installed such bells not for servants, but for more personal calls. The bell wasn't rung for meals, it was rung for obedience. I hadn't noticed it at first, not until the night it rang. A soft chime, delicate, but in that silence, deeper than midnight, colder than December, it sounded like thunder. I was outside her chamber, as always. My chair leaned back just slightly, hands tucked beneath my coat for warmth, and then that sound. One chime, not frantic, not urgent, just clear. I stood before the sound faded, opened the heavy door, oak from the forests of Sepis, carved with the family crest, stepped inside. She was awake, waiting. Her bed was enormous, carved walnut, gilded edges, sheets pale as bone. Imported Italian silk,
died in the deep dyes only the Thurzo family could afford. And there she lay, half-turned, one bare arm stretched overhead, the other resting lightly on her chest. The bell rope still trembled beside her, as if touched with longing. She didn't speak. She never did when the bell rang. She only looked, and I knew what she wanted. I approached in silence. No footsteps, no breath. There was a silver tray at the end of her bed. On it, a carafe of warm wine spiced with clove and poppy, and a single silk ribbon. Red. I lifted it carefully, held it in my palm like something sacred. She turned her face slightly, that pale cheek catching the firelight. Still silent. There were rules, unspoken but strict. Never touch unless touched. Never speak unless spoken to. Never refuse. I placed the ribbon where she wished, across her throat, like a collar. Not tight, just enough. Her eyes closed, and I left. Back through the heavy door, back to my chair. The bell no longer moved. But I didn't sit. I stood there, listening, for breath, for movement, for another chime. It never came. That night I asked the old nurse about the bell. She was the only one who had served before me. She remembered the Count's father, the plagues, the famine winters. When I mentioned it, she crossed herself. That bell, she said, was once for pain. Now it is for pleasure. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to, because the next night it rang again.
It was on the western side of the keep, a corner tower, older than the rest of the estate, built long before her birth, perhaps long before her family ever wore titles. She called it the Quiet Room. No one else had the key, not the steward, not the housekeeper, not even me. But I had seen inside, once. It happened during the late rains, the kind that dragged across the Carpathian hills for days, making the world outside feel sodden, blurred, unreal. She sent for me at dusk. No bell this time, just a folded note, thick vellum, the scent of rosemary still clinging to it. One word, come. I followed the corridor westward, past the chapel, past the empty guest wing, to the spiral stairs carved from limestone, worn from centuries of feet and secrets. At the top, a single oak door, no handle, only a small brass knocker shaped like a swan with eyes made of garnet. When she opened it, she wore nothing but a robe, cream-colored, hung open at the collar. Her hair, still damp, fell in a long curtain down her back. Behind her, the room glowed gold. No windows, just candlelight, dozens of them, on every shelf, ledge, and sill. The scent hit me first, not perfume, but ambergris, beeswax, something darker, like wet parchment left too long in old leather. Then I saw the walls, covered in tapestries, Hungarian, 15th century, hand-woven in Bardiof, scenes of women bathing in forest pools, of swans turning into girls, of men kneeling. At the center of the room, a chaise, not a bed, not a throne, something in between. She stepped back, letting me enter. And then she turned the key. From the inside. There was no lock on the outside, only in. I watched as she slid the key beneath a loose stone beside the wall. A gesture of trust, or perhaps a ritual. She told me nothing, but moved to the chaise and sat. One leg curled beneath her, the other stretched out, bare, toes painted red. I remained by the door, waiting. The candles hissed quietly. Somewhere beneath us, a pipe moaned, the old castle breathing. She lifted a small book from the table beside her, worn leather, no title. She opened it to a marked page, held it out, not to read, to kiss. I stepped forward. The text was in Latin. Lines of invocation, something ecclesiastical, but the ink was brown, too brown, and in the margins were fingerprints. She placed the book gently in my hands, then pulled the robe from her shoulder. Slowly. That's all. No more. I left after exactly 1 hour. She unlocked the door herself. And from that day forward, the quiet room remained hers alone, locked from the inside, always, except when the rains came.
It was only discovered by accident. One of the boys, sent to oil the hinges in the east corridor, stepped too hard near the window seat, and the board gave a little, just enough. The castle is old. The bones of it shift in the winter, and that part, the eastern wing, was built during the reign of King Louis II, before Mohawks fell, before Hungary bled into 3. I was summoned to inspect it. They thought it might be rot, but it wasn't. It was hollow. I knelt beside the floorboard, traced the grain with my fingers, then lifted it gently. No dust, no mice, just linen wrapped tight, yellowed. And inside it, a letter, folded 4 times, pressed flat by time. No wax seal, but a faint trace of crimson still clung to the edge, like the kiss of a painted mouth. The handwriting? Not hers. It belonged to someone older, sharper. Latin again, but personal. A mix of script and symbol, like the kind used by Jesuit scholars when writing to each other about forbidden things, astrology, anatomy, desire. I should not have read it, but I did. The letter was addressed to her, by name, not Lady Bathory, not my Countess, just Elizabeth. It began tenderly, a memory, a moment beneath the linden trees near Bathory, where they once shared a book and a kiss, but then it turned, darker. He wrote of a practice, something they began in secret at the court of Vienna, a ritual meant to preserve beauty, not with potions. No, that word never appeared, but in presence, of being surrounded by youth, by heat, by trembling voices. Let them love you, he wrote. Let them adore you, even in fear. The body knows not the difference. He signed only with a symbol, a serpent coiled around a mirror. I hid the letter in my coat, said nothing to the boy. That night, I brought it to her chamber. She was seated at her vanity, hair unbound, back exposed to the fire. I placed the letter on the table beside her. She didn't look at it, didn't even blink. Instead, she reached for a hairpin, a long one, black pearl, and handed it to me. "Burn it," she said, "then bring the ashes to my room." I did as told. The flames ate the parchment fast, but the ink, the crimson, sizzled slow. I collected the ash in a shallow bowl and brought it back. She was waiting in silence, hands open, palms upward. And without a word, she dipped her fingers in the remains and touched them to her throat. A line down the center, then across her collarbone. A mark. Old magic or just memory. Either way, she slept soundly that night, and I did not.
It was said the bells of Transcend rang for 3 days, and still no one could hear the groom's heart. Ferenc Nádasdy, the Black Knight of Hungary, war hero, a man of scars and sermons. He was 26. She was just 15. But already she knew how to hold a room. I wasn't there, of course. Not yet. But the maid still whispered of it, even years later, as if the wedding itself had never truly ended, as if something had stayed behind in those stone halls, echoing. The castle was draped in red that day. Banners from Pressburg, Buda, Vienna. Knights dined beside poets, Jesuits at one table, alchemists at another. And she wore white. Not out of piety, but defiance. The gown had no sleeves, shoulders bare in the March air. Pearls lined the bodice, but none at her throat. That she left untouched. They said her mother wept, not from joy, but from something older, something colder. Ferenc did not weep. He drank. And when they placed her hand in his, he bowed so low that his lips brushed her knuckles. But she did not smile. She only watched. Later that night, long after the feast, a servant found her alone in the great hall, still in her wedding gown, still awake. She stood beneath the painted ceiling, arms stretched wide, reciting a poem in Latin, one none of them recognized. Some thought it was a prayer, others a spell. She had learned it from a book her aunt gave her. That aunt, the one burned in 1574 for inviting the devil into her bathwater. Of course, they never spoke of that in public, but every girl in the Bathory line knew the story. The bride lit a single candle and walked the halls barefoot all the way to the East Tower, the same one she would later seal shut. After the screams. That was her wedding night. Not in bed, not with a man, but in silence, alone. They say Ferenc did not lie with her until 3 nights later. Even then, he returned to battle within a week. She remained in that stone castle, with its veiled corridors and arched mirrors. And from that day forward, she wrote down every dream she had, no matter how strange, no matter how wet. She locked them in a cabinet beside her bed and burned them all the night Ferenc died.
She didn't cry when he died. Not in front of anyone, at least. Not even the priest who came with the letter from Vienna, still wet from the rain. Ferenc had fallen sick, not in battle, but in bed. A sudden fever, they said, something quick and cruel. He died in January 1604. And she wore black by morning. But it wasn't mourning, not the kind that clings. Her gown was velvet, high-collared, tightly laced at the waist. And her gloves, those I remember most. They were not sewn in haste. They were waiting, as if she had known. Black satin, stitched with fine thread, and lined, not with fur, as was custom in cold months, but velvet, deep burgundy, the kind of fabric that warms from the inside. She wore them everywhere in the weeks after, through the snow, through the services, through the prayers. She even touched the crucifix with them, the first night they tolled the bells. And still, no one questioned, because she played the part well. The grieving wife, the noble widow. But I saw her in private. I saw what she did when the hall was quiet, when the candles burned low and the mirrors stopped reflecting. She would slip the gloves off, slowly, finger by finger, as if peeling back skin. And then she would press her hands to the fire, not for warmth, but for feeling. She needed to feel something, anything. And once I caught her whispering, not to God, but to him, to Ferenc. "You left too early," she said, her voice barely a breath. "You promised you'd teach me how to win." Ferenc had been cruel, yes, but never careless. Before he died, he had left her maps, letters, names of enemies, and a gift hidden in a chest beneath the stone stairs. Inside it, a dagger, polished bone handle, and a note. Keep it close, not for protection, for memory. She never carried it in public, but she kept it near her bed. Even now, I can still hear the whisper of that blade sliding from its sheath, just before sleep, just after prayer. Not in fear, but in hunger, the kind of hunger that no longer waits to be fed.
It was late spring when he arrived, barely 16, with hay in his hair and calluses on his hands. He came from the Sharver estate, one of many Ferenc had left behind, along with deaths, rumors, and boys. The others said he was there to tend the gardens, but I knew better. So did she. Elizabeth had always preferred the quiet ones. Not timid, quiet. There's a difference. This one, he never looked her in the eye, but he noticed everything. How she stirred her wine with her finger before sipping. How her skirts whispered along the floor, 2 beats behind her steps. How she never crossed herself at chapel, but bowed at the threshold just once, as if greeting an equal. He watched, and she let him. I saw the way she tested him, dropping her handkerchief slowly, like a question, letting him pick it up without looking. The first time she called him into her chambers, it was raining, soft, steady, like breath against skin. She was brushing her hair, dark waves still damp from her bath. Her robe clung to her shoulders, loose but not careless. He stood in the doorway, silent, still. "Do you know how to play chess?" she asked. He nodded, but didn't move. "Good," she said, "because I don't." He stayed for hours. No one heard them speak. No one dared knock. But the next morning she wore her hair unbraided, and the boy from Sharver no longer slept with the other servants. She didn't love him, not the way others might. No, what she loved was his softness, the way he listened, the way he didn't ask. He never touched her first, not once. But when she leaned in, lips to his throat, breath hot against his collarbone, he trembled like a candle. She liked that, the trembling. It made her feel powerful, alive. But power always asks for more, and desire never stays sweet for long.
He grew bolder in the second week, a little taller perhaps, or maybe she just stood closer. She let him touch her then, hesitant fingers tracing the curve of her wrist, the hollow at her throat. He called her "my lady" with a voice just above a whisper. And she smiled, at first. But youth forgets its place, especially when kissed too often and flattered too easily. By the 3rd week, he spoke with others, lingered in the kitchens, laughed a little too freely with the stable girl from Shete. Elizabeth noticed. Of course she did. It was over a basin of rose water that she asked, "Does she smell sweeter than I do?" He froze, hands wet, soap clinging to his knuckles. "I don't know what you mean." She tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No." She stepped closer, took his wrist in hers, pressed it to her cheek, then lower, then let go. "Wash properly," she said, soft as silk. "You reek of disloyalty." The next night, she summoned him again, but this time the room was colder, the fire left unlit, the wine untouched. And when he reached for her, she turned away. Let him chase, let him beg. She liked that. By morning, he didn't laugh in the kitchen. He didn't look at the stable girl. He barely looked at himself. It wasn't pain she gave him, not yet. It was distance, and that, somehow, cut deeper. I saw her watching him in the courtyard, through the lace curtains, like a cat studies a bird who no longer flutters. And I remember what she whispered that night,
just before the candles died. "If you make me feel replaceable, I'll remind you what it means to be owned."
It happened on the third night of rain. He didn't come. She waited, hair unbound, skin still damp, a robe of white satin clinging in places he used to worship with his eyes. But the door stayed closed. The hourglass ran dry. The candles dripped into silence. And still, nothing. I found her in the morning, alone, awake, unmoving. The boy had gone to the village, they said, to fetch medicine for an old groom with fever, to do his duty. But to Elizabeth, it was betrayal. She didn't speak when I told her. She didn't blink, only poured her tea with a hand that didn't shake, not even a little. That afternoon she called for him. He came, smelled of horses, eyes soft, like always, but wary now. He could feel it, the tension in the curtains, the weight in the air. She didn't offer him wine, didn't reach for his hand, just circled him slowly, like a seamstress inspecting her work. "You missed our evening," she said. I was needed. The groom was burning with fever. I only meant—" She raised a finger, not to strike, worse, to silence. "You meant—" she echoed, then stepped closer. She pulled the collar of his shirt wide, slowly, revealed a bruise on his collarbone, faint, round, shaped like a kiss, but not hers, not this time. The silence thickened. He swallowed, looked at the ground, and whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't scream, didn't slap, didn't accuse. She only said, "Strip." And he did. In that chamber of velvet and stone, he stood shivering, bare under her gaze. She walked to the fire poker, ornate, twisted iron, and touched it, but didn't lift. Instead, she turned and kissed him, hard, slow, controlling, then whispered at his lips, "Next time you stray, you'll bleed for it." And she left, robes sweeping the floor, calm as a queen. He stood there, eyes wide, breath stolen. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did I. Because something had shifted in her. She had tasted restraint and found it bitter. Next time, I knew.
She arrived with little warning. No trumpet, no velvet carriage, just the sound of hooves in the wet gravel and a scent of lavender oil that clung to her every step. Lady Clara Bathory, older sister of Elizabeth's late father, a widow twice over, a woman who dressed in black even when the sun was out and smiled only when someone else cried. I had not seen her in 10 years, but her presence hadn't dulled. It had fermented, sharpened. She walked through Sechta Castle as if she still owned it. Elizabeth waited for her in the green drawing room, a place she never used. Too many windows, not enough secrets. They didn't embrace, they never did. "My darling niece," Clara said, removing her gloves. "Still playing queen in a corner of the kingdom?" Elizabeth only tilted her head. "Still outliving your husband's aunt?" There was a flicker of amusement in Clara's eye. The game had begun. They sat. Tea was poured, neither drank. I hear whispers, young men being dismissed in the night, servants avoiding your corridors, the villagers crossing themselves when they speak your name. Elizabeth smiled, slow and cruel. They always feared clever women. "No," Clara replied, voice like iron wrapped in silk. "They fear women who forget the blade swings both ways." The silence was thick enough to taste. Then Elizabeth leaned forward. "So why come? To scold me? To save me?" Clara looked at her, eyes sharp as winter. "To warn you." She placed something on the table, A brooch, old, Hungarian gold, shaped like a falcon. I wore this when I was your age, when I thought I was untouchable. Elizabeth reached for it, then stopped. Clara whispered, "He gave it to me, the man I ruined, the ones whose family still curses mine." A pause. I buried him with my smile, but his ghost stayed. Then she stood. "Enjoy your power, Elizabeth, but don't let it enjoy you." And just like that, she left. The air in the drawing room didn't move for a full hour. Neither did Elizabeth. That night, she held the brooch in her palm for a long time. Didn't wear it, just stared. I watched her from the hallway. She didn't cry, didn't speak, but for the first time, she looked as if something might hurt her. Something real.
He came back. Of course he did. They always do, when love is laced with fear, and fear wears perfume. The boy entered through the servants' wing, head low, but eyes still full of her. A glance upward was all it took. She saw the bruise on his pride, not his skin. That she hadn't marked, yet. She let him wait in her chamber. 3 hours. No food, no fire, just candlelight and a chair too small for comfort. When she entered, she said nothing. She circled, slow, deliberate, the silence wrapping around his neck like a velvet noose. He stood to speak. She raised a finger, no words. Instead, she handed him a box, thin, long, lacquered red. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a silk ribbon, black, wider than a choker, softer than breath. "Put it on," she said. He hesitated, only once, then tied it around his neck. She stepped forward and adjusted the knot, tighter. He swallowed. "You belong to me," she whispered. "Say it. I belong to you." She didn't smile, but her eyes sparkled. That night she did not strike him. No whips, no blades, not yet. She used words instead. "I know where you looked when you rode into town. I know whose scent clung to your hands. I know what disloyalty tastes like, and it's always bitter." She kissed him then, deep, cruel, a kiss that claimed, then pulled away. "You want to prove your devotion?" "Yes." "Good." She pointed to the mirror. "Undress and kneel." He obeyed, but not from lust, not quite. It was something darker now, something that bound and blurred. She watched, said nothing, and when he looked up trembling, exposed, she handed him a silver brush. "Start with your thighs," she said. "Brush until I say stop." And so he did. Slow strokes, over skin still marked from old rides, from youthful games, now repurposed, rewritten. She stood above him, silent, still, but in her eyes a hunger bloomed, not for blood, not yet, but for power, taken slowly, lovingly. The first thorn had entered the skin, and he thanked her for it.
The fire burned low, but not her patience. Tonight was not about passion, it was about precision. He arrived late, only a few minutes, but enough. She noticed. Of course she did. He bowed quickly, offered apologies, but she merely gestured to the chair near the hearth. "Sit," she said, her tone soft but absolute.
The room was silent, save for the slow ticking of the gilt clock on the mantel. She took her time, each step deliberate, each glance a measurement. "You forgot," she said. He frowned. "Forgot what, my lady?" Her eyes did not blink. "The ribbon." He reached instinctively for his throat, bare. His face paled. "Forgive me." Elizabeth didn't speak. She turned instead, walked to the sideboard where her riding crop rested, unused, polished, waiting. She picked it up like one might pick up a wine glass, gracefully, with pleasure. "I forgive," she said, walking toward him, "when I am reminded why I should." He didn't move. She drew the crop down the side of his neck, not striking, just tracing, a tease, a warning. "You will learn," she said softly, "that obedience is not a mood, it's a rhythm." Then she stepped back. "Kneel." He kneeled. The rug beneath him was soft, Hungarian wool hand-woven, but his body trembled as if kneeling on stone. She circled once, twice. Then she whispered, "Raise your palms." He did. She placed the crop across them. He flinched, but it did not strike. "Hold it," she said, "steady." And she watched. 2 minutes, 5, 7. His arms began to shake, his breath shallow, but she said nothing. This was not punishment, it was instruction. When his hands finally dropped, she caught the crop mid-air, didn't let it touch the ground. "You're learning," she whispered. "Pain is not always cruelty. Sometimes it's memory with teeth." She cupped his face, not cruel now, tender. "Tomorrow," she said, "you'll arrive early, wearing the ribbon, and you'll thank me for this." He nodded. And as he stood to leave, still trembling, still unsure, he kissed her hand, not from love, from surrender.
I had been in the castle long before he arrived, long before the ribbons, the games, the hush of pleasure mistaken for prayer. I swept the floors outside her chamber, polished the brass handles she never touched, lit the candles that flickered with secrets, and I listened. At first, it was curiosity, a boy's whimper, a laugh too sharp to be tender, a thud, like something dropped. But soon, it became ritual. When dusk fell and she summoned him, I stayed close, not out of disloyalty, but because I feared what might become of her. The Countess, my lady, she had changed since the funeral. Ferench's death left a hollow, but she hadn't filled it with tears. She filled it with control, with silence, dressed in silk. And now this boy, young, sun-warmed, pliable, he had become her altar. I saw him once in the corridor, his lips marked by her bite, his eyes wide like a stag in snow. He smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. I asked no questions. That's how one survives in Chalkdits. But that night, as I passed her door, the lock half turned, I paused. Inside, her voice, low, deliberate, each word a thread. "What will you give me tonight?" she whispered. Then his voice, unsteady. "Anything." I closed my eyes. I knew that tone. It was not devotion. It was drowning.
I backed away, quick but silent, and I made a choice. The chapel lay empty most nights, but the old nun, Sister Margaret, still prayed. I found her bent over the altar, hands bruised by time, eyes sharp as salt. I didn't tell her everything, only enough. Enough for her to raise an eyebrow and say she must not be left alone in that hunger. I nodded, and for the first time I felt the chill, not from the cold stone floors beneath my feet, but from the thought that maybe she wasn't consuming them. Maybe she was becoming something else entirely.
She knew. Of course she knew. The hallway had a draft that whistled only when someone lingered, and last night the air had sung a little too long. This morning she did not speak of it. She simply burned a different perfume, something darker, less roses, more resin, a scent that curled through the halls like a question left unanswered. By midday, she was in the west corridor, near the chapel. She never visited there, not since Ferenc was buried, not since the prayers began sounding like accusations. But today, her fingers traced the stone arch of the door, not reverently, like a woman testing the frame of a painting she might replace. Inside, Sister Margaret knelt, her back stiff with years and warnings. She did not rise as Elizabeth entered. That, too, was a kind of power. "I've heard whispers," the nun said, not turning, "about the boy and others before him." Elizabeth smiled, not cruelly, just knowingly. "I've heard whispers too, sister," she replied, "about saints who bled for nothing, and women who kissed no one but the pages of their books." Sister Margaret stood. Their eyes met, the Countess in black velvet, the nun in ash linen. Two kinds of women, two kinds of devotion. "You seek something," the nun said, "beyond the body." Elizabeth tilted her head. "Don't we all?" Margaret stepped closer. "But where will it end?" Elizabeth's voice dropped. "Where it must." Then, silence. The kind that sits heavy, the kind that waits. Before leaving, Elizabeth paused beside the altar. She reached out, not to cross herself, not to pray, but to run a gloved finger through the dust on the pew. Then she looked at the mark it left, a clean line, a scar through gray. She smiled. "Your God watches," she whispered, "but mine listens." And with that, she was gone. But the chapel stayed colder after she left, as if her shadow lingered longer than her body.
He came from the vineyards near Vog, a second son with soft hands and too much poetry in his head. The kind the village said would never plow, never marry, but would look at the sky and sigh, as if the clouds might answer him. His name was Miklos, and I remember how he walked the castle halls like a boy inside a dream or a trap. He arrived weeks after the funeral, when the black crepe still hung stiff along the walls, but her veils had begun to slip. Elizabeth noticed him before the guards did. Of course she did. She always had a taste for quiet ones. They held more room for her words. he'd been sent to carry wine. Just that, nothing more. But she asked him to stay. And from that moment, he was never quite his own again. I watched him from the servants' corridor. He would wait outside her room for hours, fingers clasped tight, like a prayer that had lost its purpose. When the door opened, he entered without hesitation, but never without fear. Not terror, no, something gentler, something like awe with teeth. And when he came out, he always looked older, not in face, but in how he held himself, like the world had become heavier. He told me once, after too much wine and not enough sleep, that when she kissed him, he felt like he was being unmade. Not broken, but rewritten. "She sees me," he whispered, "and I think I want her to." I should have warned him. I should have said what I knew, that to be seen by her was not the same as being loved. It was to become useful, beautiful, and eventually forgettable. But I said nothing, because a part of me envied him, not for her attention, but for the illusion that it meant something. By autumn, his shoulders stooped. His voice grew softer. She had not struck him, not yet, but she had begun to take. Little things. His music, his laughter, his name. She called him Little Wolf now. And when he answered, he smiled, but his eyes were glass.
She waited until he was lulled, softened by silk sheets, and her breath warm at his throat. That's when she first asked, not demanded. No, Elizabeth never started with cruelty. She began with curiosity, with a whisper so gentle it slid past your spine before your mind caught it. "Miklush," she said, fingers playing in the curls at his nape, "would you do something for me?" He blinked in the candlelight, naked, flushed, lost. "Of course, my lady. Not countess, not madam, just my lady," like a song hummed in the dark. She smiled, not wide, but deep. "There's a girl in the lower kitchens, blonde, soft-voiced, always stares when you pass." He stiffened. "She's nothing," he said too quickly. Elizabeth's nails tapped his chest. 1, 2, 3. "I know that," she said, "but I want you to show her." He hesitated. "Show her what?" Elizabeth rolled atop him, slow, like dusk swallowing a field. "Show her," she purred, "that your eyes are mine, that your hands don't wander, that she is not in the story." He tried to laugh, failed. "That's cruel," he whispered. Elizabeth's lips brushed his ear. "So is longing, little wolf." The next day, he didn't go to the kitchens, but she sent him anyway, under the pretense of checking the wine. I followed at a distance, always watching, always listening. He found the girl by the hearth, scrubbing pots. Her name was Agnes. Pretty, yes, but not bold, just kind, which,
in this castle was rarer than gold. She looked up and smiled. Miklos did not smile back. He didn't touch her, didn't speak. He simply stood there, long enough to make her hands tremble in the basin. Then he turned and walked away. That night, Elizabeth kissed him longer than usual, and when he closed his eyes, she whispered something I will never forget. Good boy.
They said she was a noblewoman from Vienna, sharp chin, cold hands, lavender scent trailing like a silk scarf through the hall. Her name, or the one she gave us, was Countess Margit von Lisi. She arrived with a retinue too large for her status and eyes too clever for her smile. Elizabeth greeted her as if they were equals. They weren't. Margit was born with court polish, the kind that wore civility like a dagger tucked behind lace. But Elizabeth had grown into her power, sharpened it, bathed it in need and heat and velvet. Their kiss on the cheek lingered just a breath too long. Not passion, calculation, like two queens assessing the same battlefield. I was there when Margit first passed Miklos in the hall. She stopped, tilted her head, and said, like it meant nothing, "He walks like a man with something to hide." Elizabeth only smiled. "You'd know, wouldn't you?" They both laughed. But later that night, I caught her watching them from the balcony. Margit in pale gray silk, Miklos at Elizabeth's feet, head in her lap, his fingers twitching in his sleep. The Countess sipped her wine, didn't blink once. The next day, Margit asked me for oil. Lavender, she said, for the nerves. I fetched it, of course, but I watched her pour just a drop into Elizabeth's bath. Not poison, nothing so vulgar. Just enough scent to confuse, to stir old memories, to open doors in the mind that should stay closed. Because lavender was what Elizabeth's mother used to wear. And I saw it work. That night the Countess spoke gently of dreams, of exile, of women who devour the world alone. Elizabeth listened too long, and Miklos, kneeling behind her, tightened his jaw. That's when I knew Margit hadn't come for hospitality. She'd come to see if the rumors were true, and perhaps to pull the string and watch the tapestry unravel.
That night, she didn't come down to supper. The great hall glowed with fire and feasting, but her seat at the head remained empty. No excuse given, none needed. When Elizabeth disappeared, we learned to wait in silence. But I lingered outside her chambers, heard nothing but the gentle creak of wood, the soft breath of sleep, and the faintest scent of lavender, not from her perfume, but from something deeper, something older. That smell didn't comfort her. It haunted. She told me once, in one of her rare tender moods, that her mother never raised her voice. She didn't have to. She'd simply open the cedar chest, pull out the lace gloves, and the child Elizabeth would stand straight, chin high, hands behind her back. I was 6, she said, eyes distant, and I already knew how to behave like a widow. That was before the fever,
before the silence in the nursery, before they told her she would inherit everything except freedom. I believe that's what she dreamt of that night. I could tell by the way she whispered in her sleep, "Mama, no, I didn't spill it." Then, suddenly, a scream. Not loud, but sharp, like bones snapping beneath velvet. I rushed in. She sat upright in bed, hair clinging to her temples, her shift damp with sweat, the sheets twisted around her legs like white restraints. "Out," she gasped before I could speak. But I didn't leave. I stepped closer, knew the look in her eyes, glassy, unfocused, aching. "Was it her again?" I asked. She didn't answer, only reached for my wrist. Her hand trembled. "Margaret," she finally whispered. "She reminds me of the way my mother used to smile when she hated something." I lit a candle, poured her wine, sat at her feet like Miklos used to before his eyes turned inward, and I waited until she told me everything about the gloves, the cold baths, the punishments made to look like etiquette, and the lavender. Always the lavender. By dawn, her voice was steady again, but something had shifted. She sent no word to Margaret, no smile, no invitation, only silence. And when the Countess passed her in the corridor the next morning, Elizabeth didn't look at her, didn't bow, didn't blink, but she whispered something, just loud enough for me to hear. "She smells like ghosts."
I knew at the moment I opened the window that morning. The scent of pine, ash, and tension. The kind of air that warns you, the kind of day that begins like a held breath. Margaret hadn't left. Most guests stayed 3 nights, 5 at most. She'd been here nearly 10, and not once had she asked for her carriage. Instead, she walked the halls like they belonged to her, fingers trailing over tapestries, pausing at locked doors, lingering near the west wing, the one we never spoke of. I caught her once, just after dusk. She was standing by the portrait of the young Ferenc, Elizabeth's late husband. Not admiring, but calculating. "You never repainted him," she murmured without turning. I said nothing. She didn't need an answer. "The eyes are wrong. They're too kind." Miklos had begun watching her too. Not with hunger, not even suspicion, but something worse. Recognition. As if he saw in her a mirror of the Countess herself. I saw them together in the garden once. No words passed, only glances. But when Margaret turned away, his fists were clenched. And that night, he asked for a whip to be delivered to Elizabeth's chambers. Not the usual one, the old one. Black leather, Hungarian braid, a relic from Ferenc's stables. I brought it, of course, but I stayed, long enough to hear. And what I heard, no screams, no moans, just breath. Deep, slow, rhythmic, as if pain had become prayer. The next morning, Elizabeth was radiant, rosy, calm, her posture a sculpture again. Margaret joined her for breakfast. The tension had returned to lace. They discussed horses, weather, the latest arrests in Bratislava. But the words didn't matter. Only the pauses did. And in one of those silences, Margaret leaned closer and whispered,
I opened the door you keep locked." Elizabeth didn't flinch, but her teacup cracked in her hand. She bled, didn't look down, only smiled, and said, "Then you must already know what happens next." She waited until dusk, not because she feared being seen, but because dusk was the Countess's hour. And Margaret had learned, if you wanted to understand a woman like Elizabeth, you had to follow her shadows, not her footsteps. The key she used was old, not one she stole, but one she'd found tucked inside the lining of a hunting glove left near the stables. Elizabeth had wanted her to find it, or maybe wanted to believe she wouldn't. Either way, the lock gave easily, and the velvet curtain slipped aside like a secret undressing itself. The room smelled of wax, parchment, and something faintly metallic, not blood. Ink, perhaps, or memory. The walls were lined with books, but not the sort kept in the Countess's library. No Bibles, no romance. These were older, bound in skins that didn't look like calf or deer. Titles written in Latin, Hungarian, German, but some in symbols she didn't recognize. One stood out, a slim volume, spine cracked, marked with a red ribbon. She opened it, and inside, a letter addressed not to Elizabeth, but to Erzsébet, her name in the old tongue. "Daughter, you will inherit the land, the name, the bones beneath our house, but power must be learned, not gifted. Read only after the first blood you spill willingly." The letter was signed with a single character, not a name, but a symbol, something between a serpent and a key. Margaret pressed the page to her chest, not in fear, in hunger. This wasn't blackmail material. This was origin, the secret no noble dared speak aloud, that power, true power, was never clean. Behind the shelves was a narrow door, not locked, but sealed by heat. She touched it, warm, almost pulsing. She didn't open it, didn't need to, because just then, from somewhere deeper in the manor, she heard it, a low, slow chant, a woman's voice, but not alone, rhythmic, measured, ancient. Margaret stepped back, tucked the letter into her bodice, and closed the velvet curtain behind her. She returned to her room in silence. No candle, no words, only one thought. She hadn't found Elizabeth's secret. She had inherited it.
She knew. Of course she knew. Elizabeth didn't need to check the keyhole or count the books on the shelf. She didn't even glance toward the west wing. She simply felt it, like a change in temperature, like a breath drawn too sharply in the dark. Margaret had crossed the line, not out of rebellion, but something colder, more deliberate. And that was what made Elizabeth smile. That evening, she dressed in blue. Not morning black, not blood red, but sapphire. Hungarian silk, long sleeves, high collar, the gown Ferenc once called her armor. She entered the dining hall without her usual delay. No servants, no candles, only a fire. And Margaret waiting. Already seated, already smirking. "You look rested," Elizabeth said. Margaret's eyes sparkled.
I slept deeply. Elizabeth sat across from her. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was ceremonial. A shifting of power, a slow transfer, still unfinished. "Did you like the library?" Elizabeth asked softly. There was no gasp, no denial, only a tilt of Margit's head. "Your ancestors were thorough." Elizabeth leaned forward, elbows on the table. "So you read the letter?" "I did." "And?" Margit smiled. "It felt like something I might have written to myself, had I been born centuries earlier. That was the moment it changed. That was when Elizabeth saw it, not curiosity, not desire, reflection. Margit wasn't trying to seduce her, wasn't trying to destroy her. She was trying to become her." They dined in silence. Roasted pheasant, root vegetables soaked in cream, honeyed pears, untouched. Elizabeth poured the wine herself, a vintage too old for a guest. Margit didn't thank her, just raised her glass and said, "To inheritance." Elizabeth didn't raise hers, only stared into the crimson pool and whispered, "Careful what you claim. The things I carry don't let go easily." Margit stood, placed her glass down, and walked behind her. No touch, just breath near her ear. "I don't want to be you. I want to be better." And then she left. Elizabeth remained by the fire, alone in the dark, listening to the silence Margit had filled. She wasn't angry. She was curious, because she too had once whispered the same words to a woman in a locked room, and that woman had vanished without ever finishing her sentence.
The wind shifted after midnight. Even the dogs knew it. Their howls grew softer, uneasy, as if the moon no longer watched. Margit didn't sleep like a guest that night. Not in a borrowed bed, not under the Countess's roof. She slept as if the castle owed her something, and it came. The dream arrived slowly. First, she stood barefoot in the corridor, surrounded by velvet walls that pulsed like lungs, breathing in time with her. Then she turned toward the forbidden staircase, the one no servant dared clean. She didn't descend, she floated. The stone beneath her was warm, as if it remembered the feet of others who never came back. She passed torches that lit themselves. She passed doors that whispered her name. And at the bottom, a chamber, circular, silent, covered in mirrors, but none of them showed her reflection. Only one did. In that mirror, Elizabeth stood. Not older, not younger, but exact. Her face, her posture, her smile. Margit raised her hand, so did the mirror. But the woman inside was not mimicking. She was watching. "You wanted this," Elizabeth's voice echoed from within. Margit nodded. "You opened the door. You read the letter. You drank the wine. Yes. You dared compare yourself to me." Margit smiled. "I didn't compare. I surpassed." The mirror cracked. Not all at once, just a fine line through the eyes. And suddenly Elizabeth stepped forward, not out of the mirror, but into her. The air left Margit's lungs, her spine arched, and then fire. Not burning, but claiming. like ink soaking into parchment, like blood accepting a new vessel. When she awoke, the sheets were drenched, not with sweat, not with fear, but something else. She rose and crossed to the mirror on the far wall. Her eyes were still hers, but they held something new, something older. She dressed before sunrise. Silk first, then leather. And when she opened her chamber door, Elizabeth was already standing there, waiting. They said nothing, but for the first time, they bowed to each other, at exactly the same depth.
That morning, the candles in the eastern hall burned lower than usual, though no one had lit them. The maids whispered about drafts. The steward claimed it was the dampness in the stones, but I knew better. I saw the way Elizabeth's hands trembled when she touched the brass candlestick, not from age, but from recognition. She had seen this before, not in a dream, in her own past. Margit no longer trailed behind her like a servant. She walked beside the Countess, not brushing, but almost grazing. Their skirts whispered secrets as they moved together. Not quite harmony, but something older than that. Reflection. And I could feel it, the tension that comes when two mirrors face each other and the space between them becomes infinite. In the chapel, Elizabeth sat first. Not at the front, not near the altar, but to the side, beneath the stained glass arch of St. Catherine, the martyr with the broken wheel. Margit sat beside her, and for the first time in years, Elizabeth did not cross herself. She folded her hands like a pagan, loose, open, waiting. The priest mumbled his Latin as usual, but I watched Margit's lips. She wasn't mouthing the prayers. She was mouthing names, old ones. Dorocha, Ilona, Anna. Names only spoken when the castle was locked. Names carved into stones too deep for the church to bless. And Elizabeth noticed. She didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. She just turned her head ever so slightly and smiled. After the service, they didn't return to the drawing room. They walked instead to the west wing, the coldest part of the manor, where portraits were kept under cloth and no fires were lit. Elizabeth reached for the draped canvas at the end of the corridor. "I was 16, she said softly, "before I learned how to hide what I wanted." She pulled the cloth back. The painting revealed a younger Elizabeth, dressed in gold, but with eyes already shadowed. Her hand rested on a red book, the same one that Margit had found. "You kept it?" Margit asked. Elizabeth didn't answer. Instead, she stepped behind her, and for the first time, she touched Margit's hair, brushed it away from her neck, bent close. Not in lust, in remembrance. "You look like her," Elizabeth whispered. "My first." Margit tilted her head. Did she last? A pause. Then, "She changed me." I couldn't hear more. The door was closed after that, and the candlelight beneath it didn't flicker until long after the bells rang for supper. But I knew. The past had returned, not to haunt, but to continue. And Margit, she was no longer just the mirror. She was the frame.
I found the first crack in the mirror on the morning after their third night. Not in the glass one. The old oval piece above Elizabeth's vanity still reflected her beauty too faithfully. But in Margit's voice, she had always spoken like dry silk, measured, studied, just enough pause to seem reverent. But that morning, she laughed, once, out loud, at something Elizabeth said that I didn't catch. And that laugh, sharp and bright, was not the sound of a servant. It was the sound of someone equal, or worse, someone who had begun to believe they were greater. Elizabeth didn't stop her. She simply raised her chin, narrowed her eyes, and smiled. But her fingers, those clever fingers, tightened around the stem of her goblet until the silver sang. And in that ringing hum, I heard what was coming. The same melody I'd heard in the year 1604, when another girl, Esther, I think, grew too clever with her lips. Elizabeth let her wear silk slippers and walk beside her in town. And then one night, the girl stepped barefoot into a basin of vinegar until her feet bled through the marble. She walked without sound after that, and Elizabeth said she preferred it. That evening I lit the bath for them, not in the usual chamber, but in the old Turkish-style room, vaulted ceiling, copper tub, no windows. Elizabeth never used that room unless she wanted to be seen. The steam coiled around them like ghosts from the east. Margit slid into the water first, her spine straight, her shoulders proud. She didn't flinch when Elizabeth poured hot water down her collarbone. Didn't even blink. But I saw her throat tighten. That tension, so slight, so practiced. Elizabeth noticed too. "Are you testing me?" she asked, brushing Margit's damp hair behind her ear. "No," Margit replied, smiling. "But you said pain is how you remember love." I dried the floors in silence as they dressed, and when I turned away to fetch their towels, I caught a flash, just a flicker, in the polished copper basin. Not their reflections, but something else. A crack. Hairline, running right through the space between them, like fate had started chiseling its way into what they'd built. That night, the Countess asked for her ring box, the one she hadn't opened in years. Inside, velvet-lined slots held tokens from all her past companions. A ribbon, a rosary bead, a milk tooth, and one long strand of blonde hair, dried and brittle, still knotted. Margit watched her finger each item. "Do you keep them all?" she asked. Elizabeth looked up. "Only the ones who hurt me." And for the first time, Margit looked afraid. Not of Elizabeth, but of how deeply she wanted to be one of them.
He arrived on horseback, soaked to the ribs in sleet, his hood lined with fox fur, his eyes ringed in shadow that had nothing to do with the journey. The servants mistook him for a courier. I knew better. He dismounted without urgency, not the clumsy caution of someone afraid, but the weary elegance of someone who had once belonged here. His name was Gaber Nadasdi, a cousin by blood, a scholar by habit, and the only man I'd ever seen who dared to kiss Elizabeth Báthory's cheek without asking. She hadn't summoned him, and still, she met him at the stairs, without fanfare, without rouge, just her, unadorned, breathing shallowly. They had known each other before the wedding, before the widow's black silk, before the walls of Chachiche bled with secrets. He was the one who taught her Latin, the one who used to correct her spelling in the margins, not with red ink, but with verses from Ovid tucked between her mistakes. She had loved him once, in the soft, unbearable way that girls do before they learn to hurt instead. That night he dined alone with her in the western chamber. No music, no servants, only me in the hallway pretending not to listen. I heard silver scrape against porcelain, heard him say, "This place is colder than it used to be." Elizabeth laughed softly, "Because you've been gone too long." A pause. "Or because you've filled it with ghosts." He stayed 2 nights. On the second, I found him in the library, staring at one of her journals, not reading, just touching the spine with a gentleness that stung. When I asked him if he needed anything, he didn't look up, just said, "She used to write poems about snow. Now she records when girls disobey." By the 3rd morning, he was ready to leave. I thought she would stop him, but she didn't. She let him mount the horse, let the hooves crush the frost, let the wind swallow whatever name she whispered as he vanished beyond the gates. Later, I found a single page left behind in the chamber where he'd slept. One line written in his old hand. Even the sharpest blade forgets it was once fire. That night, she burned every letter he'd ever sent her, all but one, the first one, the one that began, "Dearest Ershebet, you are not a monster yet."
Her name was Margit. I remember that now. She had freckles like sugar spilled on warm bread. A small, forgettable thing, until you caught her watching. She watched everything. When she swept the floor, her eyes weren't on the dust. They were on her, the Countess, watching how she walked, how she touched the stem of a wine glass, how she dismissed a servant with one flick of her ringed hand. Margit didn't flinch at the harshness, didn't blink at the bruises. She only watched, and sometimes smiled. There's a kind of girl who doesn't run from darkness. She follows it. At first, we thought it was fear. Then we thought it was foolishness. But I began to wonder, was it desire? One evening, I saw Margit carrying linens toward the private bath, a place only the Countess herself entered. A place where heat curled the air, where mirrors fogged with secrets. No one told her to go there. She told herself. And Elizabeth let her. Inside the marble chamber, Margit folded towels slowly, too slowly, her gaze slipping toward the basin where warm water shimmered like molten pearl. The Countess stepped into the bath, bare, unshamed, her back slick with oil, her arms spread like a statue. Margit did not look away. Elizabeth smiled, not with her mouth, but with her eyes. She reached behind her and, without turning, held out her hand. Scrub. It was not a command.
It was a test. Margit obeyed. With trembling fingers, she touched the cloth to the Countess's spine, not with disgust, with reverence, as if she were polishing an idol, as if she were being baptized into something darker than religion. Afterwards, the Countess dismissed her without a word. But Margit didn't sleep that night. I found her in the hallway, whispering to herself, half a prayer, half a promise. Something inside her had shifted. She was no longer a servant who feared the mistress. She was a girl who wanted to become her. I've seen love, I've seen terror, but what Margit carried in her chest was worship. And that, I think, is the most dangerous thing anyone can offer a woman like Elizabeth. Because once you bow too deeply, you forget how to stand.
She was new, a girl from the lowlands near Trenxen, with calloused hands and eyes that refused to lower. Her name escapes me now, not because she was forgettable, but because she would not let herself be remembered the way Elizabeth wanted. She wouldn't wear the perfume, wouldn't bow as deep, wouldn't learn the rhythm of the Countess's walk or the heat of her voice when it turned from silk into steel. She said no. No to the dress they gave her. No to the mouthful of rules. No when Elizabeth touched her chin and tilted it toward the light. "You'll learn," the Countess had whispered, "or you'll bleed." She didn't learn, and so she bled. But not before she screamed. It rang out through the courtyard, sharp and sudden, cutting through snow and stone and silence. I was outside gathering firewood. The air froze around me. The ravens scattered. Inside, I imagine Margit flinched, or perhaps she smiled. You see, by now, the girls had begun to form two kinds, those who fled and those who leaned closer. Later, when the chamber doors opened, we found the girl crumpled against the base of a statue, the marble feet of Saint Elizabeth soaked in a halo of red. But not too much. The Countess was careful with the face. She always was. That night, she dined alone. The long table stretched like a tongue of silence, candles low, wine untouched. I lingered near the archway, pretending to adjust the drapes, watching her fingers drum softly against the rim of her goblet. Then, softly, "Some things," she said, "are more beautiful when they resist." I don't know what she meant, but I remember that moment, the way the firelight flickered against her cheekbones, the tension in her jaw, the hunger behind her calm. I think, in that girl's defiance, Elizabeth saw something she hadn't felt in months. Friction. Friction strong enough to spark. And she missed the burn. In the days that followed, she grew quiet, almost gentle. Margit watched her like a cat watches another cat, tail twitching, waiting. But I knew another scream would come, and the next one wouldn't be from the mouth of a stranger. It would come from someone who had once smiled at her bath.
The chapel sat apart from the castle, tucked between bare trees in the withered hush of forgotten graves. No guards posted, no candles lit, just frost on the stone steps and silence thick as breath. She only went there when the need burned deep. Not for prayer, not in the way you or I might understand it. No, this was not a place for mercy. This was where Elizabeth spoke to the dead. The man she whispered to was not her husband, not Ferenc. That grave had long grown cold in her memory. This was someone older, a shadow from her girlhood, a distant uncle, some claimed, or perhaps a priest with rough hands and lessons shaped like scars. His name was never spoken, not aloud, but I found his face once in a tiny portrait tucked inside the back of her mirror drawer, painted in black ink, creased at the corners, and touched with what looked like, God forgive me, a kiss of blood. In that chapel, Elizabeth knelt before the altar, but kept her eyes on the stones beneath her knees. She murmured, not in Latin, not in Hungarian, something older, crooked syllables that curled in the corners of the air. Sometimes she clawed the skin of her own palms, drawing thin lines of red and pressing them against the stone as if signing a pact. Other times, she laughed. Not wildly, not like madness, but low, like a woman who remembered something no one else dared speak of. I watched her once, through the half-cracked wooden door, snow melting on my boots, lungs tight from holding breath. She was radiant. Not beautiful, no. More than that. She looked like something lit from within, as if grief had become flame and shame had long since been turned to ash. I couldn't move, couldn't look away, not even when she turned, and her gaze met mine through the slit in the door. She didn't blink, didn't frown, just stared until I lowered my eyes and prayed the frost would swallow me whole. When I finally dared look again, she was gone. They say faith is a comfort, that prayer is a bridge between soul and salvation, but not hers. Elizabeth's chapel was no bridge. It was a furnace, a place to melt the pieces of herself she could no longer carry. And as winter clung to the edges of that little chapel, I knew spring would come, and with it, a new appetite.
She came on the first wind of spring, a girl of 17, carrying a letter sealed with wax and fear. The carriage stopped just past the gates, its wheels muddied by thawed snow. I remember her stepping down, boots too soft for the gravel, eyes wide as cathedral glass. Her name was Zofia, a cousin's daughter, noble enough to be proud, but not enough to be untouchable. Elizabeth greeted her on the stone terrace, draped in violet silk, her hair pinned with pearls like frozen tears. She took the girl's hand, pressed a kiss just above the knuckles, and held it a breath too long. "Do you believe in second chances, Zofia?" That was the first thing she said. Not welcome, not how was the road, just that question, sweeter than honey in a poisoned cup. Zofia blushed, nodded, did not understand, not yet. That evening, the Countess dined in a private room, just the two of them. I stood behind the door, listening to the sound of laughter, of goblets touching, of silk shifting against silk. Elizabeth spoke low. She spoke like she was telling secrets meant for no one else, of how love can be twisted, how men take and take until a woman forgets her own name. She spoke of suffering like it was art,
Zofia listened, eyes wide, cheeks flushed pink under candlelight. Later, I passed her chamber. The girl was at the mirror. Her gown had slipped from one shoulder, revealing pale skin dappled with heat. She traced her collarbone with 2 fingers, then paused, startled by her own reflection. I wondered what she saw. A guest? A student? A sacrifice? Elizabeth did not touch her, not yet. She was patient with the ones she liked. She let desire ferment, let confusion take root like ivy in spring. And Zofia was already changing. She smiled differently by the second day, walked slower, lingered longer at Elizabeth's side. In the courtyard, the other girls whispered, some with jealousy, some with dread. They knew the rhythm. They knew the scent of danger perfumed with lilacs. But Zofia was enchanted, too proud, too curious, too eager to be special. She thought herself chosen, and perhaps
There was a melody in the West Wing that no one else dared to follow. It drifted through the corridors on slow afternoons, drawn from ivory keys half-chipped by age. And something else, something beneath the varnish, like bone. Zofia followed it. Of course she did. The girl had learned by now that what Elizabeth offered was never quite given, but always earned. The doors to the music room creaked like tired joints. Inside, dust curled through beams of amber light. And there she was, the Countess at the harpsichord, fingers trailing over the keys like a spider's touch. No sheet music, no notes, just memory and hunger. "You play?" Elizabeth asked, without looking back. Zofia nodded, too quickly. "Only a little." The Countess turned slowly. Her gown rustled, thick as blood. "Then play a little." She rose, leaving the bench warm. Zofia sat in her place, as if stepping into a circle drawn with salt. Her fingers trembled. The keys answered her, hesitant, breathless, a lullaby half-remembered from a childhood too distant to be safe. Elizabeth listened from the divan, her head tilted, one slipper grazing the floor like a pendulum. "Do you know what this room was before it became mine?" she asked. Zofia shook her head. "A chapel," Elizabeth whispered. "Long ago." She rose again, walked slowly behind the girl, not touching, but close enough that her perfume blurred the notes. "It echoes differently when you play with your heart full." Zofia's hands faltered. Elizabeth smiled. "Try again, but this time imagine you're praying for something." The girl closed her eyes, played, and the melody shifted from shy to aching, from innocence to need. The room swelled with it. The chapel still lived beneath the velvet and dust, but it prayed not to God, only to her. Elizabeth leaned down, her breath brushing Zofia's ear like a confession. "You play beautifully when you surrender." Later that night, Zofia stayed in her chambers, her pulse still strung tight. She had not been touched, but something had been taken, or given. She couldn't say which. The harpsichord remained silent, but the melody lingered in her spine, in her sleep. And in the room next door, Elizabeth hummed softly, rewriting the hymn.
I still remember the first time I saw her eyes on Zofia. Not lust, no. That came later. At first, it was something colder, curiosity. Like a scholar pulling the wings off a moth just to see if it still flutters. Zofia didn't stand a chance. None of them ever did. They think beauty is protection in this place. It's not. It's bait. I've served the Bathory name since I had teeth, held linen soaked in noble blood, wiped spittle from a dying bishop's mouth, scrubbed sins off marble floors no priest dared enter. I've seen what happens to the ones she touches. They glow for a while, like embers, but they always burn out. Zofia began wearing her hair differently, looser, softer, not for herself, never. She started skipping meals, then eating only when summoned. Her laugh quieted, her hands shook, but she called it music. And that scent, the Countess's perfume, it lingered on her wrists long after she left the room. I asked once, gently, if she was all right. She only smiled. The Countess says I have talent. They always think it's about talent, but it's never about talent. It's about obedience. I've watched girls fade like morning mist through these halls. One day they're dancing barefoot on the stone. The next, you're washing their blood from lace and lying to their mothers. But Zofia, she was different. Not because she was stronger, because she wanted to be chosen. And that's the cruelest trick Elizabeth ever played. She makes them want the cage, even beg for it. That night, I passed her chamber and heard music again. Only it wasn't from the harpsichord. It was humming, soft, coaxing, like a lullaby sung at a funeral. I paused, held my breath, and then laughter. Low, feminine, two voices, one teaching, one learning. And I knew whatever prayers Zofia had whispered through those keys had been answered, but not by heaven. She came to me barefoot that night, not sneaking, not shy. She floated, almost, like she belonged to the air more than the stone beneath her feet. Her nightgown clung like a question no one dared ask, and in her hand she carried something that wasn't hers, the Countess's comb, ivory, sharp, still tangled with a strand of raven hair. I should have stopped her, but I didn't, because something in her eyes had changed. She used to look up when she spoke of Elizabeth, like the way nuns gaze at crucifixes. Now she looked straight ahead, like a mirror. "Play something," I said, to fill the silence. She went to the harpsichord, but didn't sit. Just touched the keys, one by one, as if checking their warmth. She asked me, Zofia whispered, if I'd ever bidden someone. My skin stiffened. She said it was the fastest way to taste truth. Then she smiled, and I saw it. There was blood in her teeth. Not much, just enough to stain the music red. Later, when the bells of Chechti struck midnight, I found her in the garden, kneeling, not in prayer, digging, fingers raw, nails dark. "What are you doing?" I asked. She didn't look up. She told me if I bury something alive, a part of me will never die. I didn't ask what it was. I couldn't, because something in the air, it smelled too warm, like soil and silk and secrets. By morning, Sophia no longer waited to be summoned. She entered Elizabeth's chamber without knocking. She wore darker dresses, no corset, and she stopped calling her Countess. She said, "My lady," but in a voice that made even the mirrors turn away. I once thought the Countess took girls apart, but that's not quite true. What she did was let them take themselves apart, slowly, lovingly, until there was nothing left but a version of her. And Sophia? She smiled now when she lied. She bled only when told to, and she played music with hunger.
She asked for a room of her own, not on the east wing with the seamstresses, not near the kitchens where the heat lingers like guilt. She asked for the room just below the tower, the one with no windows, where the walls were once part of the dungeon. I knew the place. No servant wanted it. Too damp, they said. Too quiet. Too full of things that listened. But Sophia smiled when I led her there, ran her fingertips along the stone like it remembered her. "This will do," she whispered, as if she'd been there before, in a different skin. She didn't ask for a bed, only bolts of velvet, 2 mirrors, and a chair she could strap someone to. She even measured the space between the legs, not for comfort, but for how far one could spread. When I hesitated, she tilted her head. "She taught me control," Sophia said. "Now I want to practice, gently." Her breath brushed my neck as she passed, but it wasn't desire in her voice. It was discipline. Elizabeth never spoke of it, but I think she watched this change with pride. She began letting Sophia answer the door when noble guests arrived. She let her choose the girls from nearby villages, even let her give orders to the guards, including me. And still, no one called her mistress. Not yet. She was still the mirror. But one day soon, I feared, she'd forget she wasn't the reflection. That winter, 3 girls disappeared from Chaite, peasant daughters, all of them. The local priest raised his voice. Elizabeth invited him to supper. She said nothing of the girls, but halfway through the meal, Sophia dropped a scrap of bloodied cloth onto his plate. "Would you bless this for me, Father?" she asked sweetly. He left before dessert. He never returned. I saw her that night, sitting in her room of stone, writing something in a small book. I asked what it was. She said, "A ledger." "Of sins?" She laughed. "No, of favors." She turned a page. "Everyone wants something. I just keep track." Before I left, I heard it. A breath. Not hers. Not mine. From behind the wall. But she didn't flinch. "They beg less when they hear themselves echo," she said. Then softly, "The walls help me listen." And I realized. She didn't just want a room. She wanted a confession box, with her as the priest, and the punishment always came before the forgiveness.
The snow never reached her windows, but I knew when winter settled into her blood, she would paint her lips darker, let her hair hang looser, and light candles she never blew out. That year, the halls felt smaller, the light dimmed faster, and her laughter turned brittle, like the crack of old bones under silk. Sophia had started wearing Elizabeth's scent. Not perfume, no, something older, clove, rose oil, and a trace of smoke, as if she bathed in something that had burned. One night, I passed by the great hall and stopped. There were no musicians, no guests, just Zofia, standing alone, turning in slow circles, barefoot, arms raised as if she were wrapped in silk that only she could feel. And Elizabeth, she sat on the dais like a queen without a court, eyes half closed, sipping from a goblet that shimmered too dark for wine. I cleared my throat. Neither of them stopped. Later, she told me, dancing alone teaches you power. I asked, and dancing for someone? She looked back at me, and for a moment, I didn't know who I was speaking to. She danced for me, Elizabeth said softly, from the shadows. She was the first to stay until the music ended. I thought I understood what they were. Two women clinging to each other's hunger, one feeding, one learning. But I saw the ledger again. Zofia had added new names, names of girls who had not yet disappeared, but were already owned. In her hand, the ink was always red, even when the quill hadn't been dipped. That same week, a cousin of Count Elizabeth's visited, a young nobleman, sharp, clean, forgettable. He came to deliver news, but stayed because he thought he was charming her. I saw Zofia slip something into his drink. Nothing deadly, just enough to slow him, to quiet him. She touched his face like she was brushing dust off a statue. Elizabeth didn't stop her. She only whispered, "Be gentle," the first time. I saw moments where Zofia became a silent huntress, her eyes watching as Elizabeth's shape shifted as if there were two bodies in the womb.
She had the mirrors taken down, all of them, from the corridors, the salons, even the antechambers where she once preened before banquets. "They lie," Elizabeth said, her voice smooth as wine turned. "They show you what you were, not what you are." At first, I thought it a passing mood. She often swayed between vanity and revulsion, but this was different. She would sit in the window's dim reflection, tracing her skin with gloved fingers, as if mapping where time had kissed and bitten. Zofia would kneel behind her, brushing that endless dark hair like she was taming a beast no one else dared touch. "You don't need mirrors," Zofia whispered. "You have me." The truth? Zofia had become her mirror. She mimicked the tilt of Elizabeth's chin, the cadence of her step, even the pause she took before giving an order, that small breath between mercy and command. It was eerie, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. One night, I entered her chamber, summoned, not by bell nor voice, but by scent. That same old clove and rose, but sharpened now, as if something inside it had been bled. She sat on the bed, silk undone. Zofia lay curled near her feet, not asleep, not quite awake either. Elizabeth didn't look at me. She just asked, "Have you ever seen yourself so clearly it made you look away?" I said nothing, because yes, I had. She rose, slow and deliberate, stepped toward the wall where a mirror once hung. Only a pale rectangle remained, surrounded by faded wallpaper, as if even the patterns had turned from her. Then she whispered, "One day, she will not need me." That night, I dreamt of two women moving in opposite directions through the same body.
one growing darker, one more hollow, and somewhere between them, the echo of a mirror, cracked but not yet broken.
They said it was an accident. The girl had slipped near the fountain, marble slick with morning dew, a fragile neck, a jagged edge. But I saw the blood. It had no fear in it, no chaos, only shape, a line too clean to be chance. Zofia stood nearby, hands folded, dress pristine, save for the faintest spray on her wrist, so fine it could have been perfume. She met my gaze, not with guilt, not even pride, with ownership. Elizabeth didn't ask what happened, didn't summon physicians or priests. She simply touched the dead girl's cheek and said she was too soft for this house. Then she turned to Zofia, brushed her knuckles across that slender jaw, and murmured something I couldn't hear. But I saw the result. Zofia smiled, the kind of smile roses wear just before they rot. Later that evening, I passed the girl's old room. It had already been emptied. No candle, no mourning, just silence and the scent of soap still clinging to her bedsheets. Zofia passed me in the corridor. She didn't slow, but as she glided past, I felt it, the cool whisper of something sharp tucked in her bodice. Elizabeth once told me, innocence makes the best perfume, but it fades too fast. I used to think she meant virginity. Now, I think she meant fear and the pleasure of watching someone lose it, drop by trembling drop. I should have warned the next girl, but I didn't, because Zofia saw me that night, and she smiled.
It began with ribbons, red ones, hung from the canopy bed, tied in loops, knots, bows, each marking a different lesson. Zofia would wake before dawn, kneel in silence, and wait, not for Elizabeth's voice, but for her gestures. A snap of fingers, a flick of the wrist, a glance too long at the left wrist or right ankle. It was a language made of flesh and expectation. And Zofia, she learned it faster than I feared. One morning, I brought in her tea. She didn't touch it. She only looked up at me from the chaise, her back straight, arms open like a queen awaiting devotion. She said, "I didn't scream today. Not proudly, not bitterly. Just fact." Elizabeth entered then, draped in a robe of green velvet, one bare foot, the other laced in black silk. She trailed her fingers down Zofia's spine as if playing notes only she could hear. Then she said, "Good girls don't scream," and kissed the spot just above her nape. They had turned pain into choreography, restraint into ceremony, and the house, it followed. Maids moved quieter, doors opened slower. Even the light through the windows seemed to bend, careful not to interrupt. Sometimes I heard sounds from behind the chamber door. Not cries, not laughter. Something in between, like silk tearing slowly. And beneath it,
Elizabeth's voice. Low, measured, loving. Yes, loving. Because that's how she taught it. Not cruelty, but refinement. Not dominance, but devotion. And Zofia, she bloomed under it, a flower taught to grow in shadow, fed not with water, but with want.
Zofia had changed, not all at once, but like wine turning in the cask, something slow, acidic, inevitable. Her voice no longer carried the tremble of a servant. It curled now, sweet as honey left too long in the sun. And when Elizabeth looked up from her letters or her laced bodice, she always smiled, not with surprise, but satisfaction. One night, I heard them speak from behind the velvet curtain. "Would you keep me if I were cruel? I would love you more." After that, Zofia began speaking in mirrors. She'd pause before them, tilt her head, and whisper as if they could answer back. Not prayers, not vanity, confessions maybe, or rehearsals. A chambermaid went missing that week, Anna, the youngest of them, a girl with cheeks like peach blossom and a nervous smile. They said she'd returned to her village, but I found her rosary snagged in the hedge near the bathhouse, and her slipper still damp. Elizabeth never asked where she'd gone. Zofia never blinked. And that night, I noticed a new scar above Zofia's left hip as she passed by in a thin linen shift, like a kiss, but sharper. Sometimes I wonder, was Elizabeth training a lover or creating a mirror? Because in Zofia's gaze, I began to see something terrifying. Recognition, the kind that doesn't ask, but answers, without mercy, without doubt. She had a thorn beneath her tongue now, and when she smiled, God help me, I wanted to see her bleed.
Few knew it existed, a chapel carved into the earth, buried beneath roots and stone and silence. It had been sealed for decades, since her grandfather's time, they said, since a priest vanished mid-sermon and the altar bled oil for 3 days. But Elizabeth found it, or perhaps it found her. She brought Zofia there first, just before dawn, the orchard above still heavy with dew, their dresses soaked up a hem, their breaths white in the morning chill. They descended with nothing but a single candle, which Elizabeth held like a priestess, not to light the way, but to bless it. Inside, the air was thick with mold and forgotten prayers. The crucifix hung crooked. A trialed shoe lay beneath a pew, blackened with rot. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She knelt before the altar, and Zofia followed. No words, just the sound of knees meeting stone and fabric rustling like old leaves. I watched from behind the vines, too afraid to breathe, too afraid not to. Elizabeth pulled something from her bodice, a folded scrap of parchment. She unfolded it, pressed it to Zofia's chest, then whispered, "Say it back." And Zofia did, voice calm, eyes wide, as if the words were not foreign, but remembered. After that, the chapel was no longer abandoned, not to them, not to the birds that no longer sang above it. They returned often, always before sunrise, always with bare feet and bitten lips. And afterward, Zofia walked differently, straighter, prouder, like someone who had been touched by something older than God and less forgiving. Elizabeth called it their consecration, but I saw the mark it left behind, on stone, on skin, on the way light refused to enter that place. She wasn't teaching Zofia to worship. She was teaching her to lead.
It began with a single scratch, a ribbon of red along Zofia's forearm, too neat to be an accident, too shallow to be punishment. I saw it as she passed me in the corridor, her sleeves rolled high, her smile low. She didn't flinch. She never did, not anymore. By the end of the week, she wore gloves. Soft kid leather, stitched with silver thread, the kind no servant could afford, no lady would wear indoors. Elizabeth gave them to her. I knew because I delivered the box myself, wrapped in violet silk, still warm from her touch. Zofia opened it slowly and said nothing, but she wore them every day after that, even to bed. I once asked her if her hands were cold. She looked at me as if I'd asked something obscene. Then she raised one gloved finger and pressed it to my lips. "No," she whispered, "they're just not mine anymore." Rumors swirled, of course, that she had taken an oath, that she had struck a deal, that beneath the gloves were things better left unseen. Marks, symbols, scars shaped like letters not taught in any church. Elizabeth never confirmed any of it, but I noticed she stopped writing in ink. She dictated everything to Zofia, and Zofia wrote, bare-handed, only then. Whatever was beneath those gloves, it bound them, not like lovers, not like mother and daughter, like flame to the candle, like blade to the sheath. Terrible together, useless apart. And somehow, Zofia became the sheath.
He arrived on a horse too fine for a man of God. No coat, no luggage, just a black cassock clinging to a body that looked better suited to a duel than a sermon. Elizabeth greeted him at the gates herself, not with a curtsy, but with a kiss. On the cheek, yes, but slow enough to turn the heads of every servant in the courtyard. Father Marcus, he called himself, a Jesuit once, expelled for reasons no one could prove. He spoke 6 languages, smoked clove cigarettes, and wore a rosary like a necklace, tangled with his collarbone, as if it had been broken and never repaired. He came to cleanse the castle. That's what he told the staff. But no holy water ever touched the stones. No chants echoed through the halls. No exorcism took place in the chapel. Instead, he spent his nights in the West Wing,
just down the hall from Elizabeth's rooms. Sometimes inside them. Zofia watched him like a dog watches a storm. Not fearfully, not angrily, just waiting. She asked no questions. She only listened. When he spoke, she tilted her head, as if trying to find the edge of the knife beneath his words. And when he looked at her, he smiled too easily, like a man who had tasted fire before and decided it wasn't so bad. I caught him once, standing outside her door, Zofia's door. He wasn't praying, he was humming, a tune I hadn't heard since the old pagan festivals before the church scrubbed them from memory. He saw me. He didn't stop, just tipped his head and said, "There are many ways to serve God." He never gave confession, never held mass, but Elizabeth kept him close, too close. And from that day on, she started wearing black lace at her throat, a sign of mourning, she claimed. But I knew she wasn't grieving a person. She was mourning something far more dangerous. Her innocence, her restraint, her need for permission. Because with Father Marcus there, she didn't ask anymore. She simply did.
It was near midnight when I saw her in the courtyard, barefoot, hair unbound, wrapped in nothing but a wolfskin cloak that brushed the cobblestones with each step. She wasn't alone. He followed, a few paces behind, silent, hands clasped like he still wore the collar of a priest. But there was nothing sacred in the way he looked at her, and nothing sinful she feared. They walked without speaking, toward the chapel. No guards, no torchlight, only the wind and the soft drag of fabric trailing behind her. Inside, the chapel candles were already lit, but not by a servant. No, this was their doing. Dozens of tiny flames flickering, not on the altar, but around the pews, in a circle, a ring, a stage. I stayed in the shadows. I shouldn't have, I know, but her silence pulled me like a chain. She stepped into the circle of flame and turned to him, not like a woman awaiting a blessing, but like a queen testing her most dangerous subject. He said nothing, just lowered his eyes, then fell to his knees and kissed her ankle. Not in lust, not in worship, something between them, something older than either. She reached down, touched his face, and whispered words I couldn't hear, but they tasted like ash on my tongue. He stood, and without breaking her gaze, he drew something from beneath his cassock, a small jar, ceramic, sealed with wax. She took it, unsealed it, and poured the thick red liquid into her palm. Not blood, at least not quite. It shimmered, too dark, too still. She smeared it across her collarbone, then down between her breasts, leaving a path like a crimson serpent curling over her heart. And then she smiled. Not at him, not at me, not at any living soul. She smiled at something I still pray I never see. The chapel bell never rang that night, but I remember the scent that followed. Burnt jasmine, wet earth, and the faintest sweetness, like honey poured over bone.
There was a mirror under her bed. Not hung on the wall, not framed in gold like the ones in her salon. No, this one lay flat, hidden beneath the mattress,
pressed against the cold stone floor. I only saw it once, by accident. She had called for rose oil, but when I entered, she wasn't in the bed. The sheets were twisted, still warm, and there on the floor, the rug had been pushed slightly aside. Just enough for the edge of the mirror to catch a glint of candlelight and wink at me. Curiosity is the most dangerous sin in her castle. I knew that, but I couldn't stop myself. I knelt. I lifted the frame just a finger's width and looked. What I saw was not the canopy, not the bed above, not even myself. I saw her, naked and looking straight back at me, though she was nowhere in the room. But it wasn't her as she was. Her hair was longer, her lips painted black, her skin too pale, too smooth, as if untouched by age or air. And her eyes, they glowed like twin coals, watching me as if I were the one trapped behind the glass. Then she smiled, and the mirror went black. I dropped it. The echo rang louder than it should have, like a scream smothered in velvet. She entered moments later, composed, unbothered. But I knew she'd heard. She always hears. She said nothing about the mirror, just took the rose oil from my hands, brushed her fingers along my wrist, and whispered, "Do you think I look better from below?" Since that night, I never step beyond the edge of her rug, and I never look beneath her bed. But sometimes, when the hall is empty and the door left ajar, I swear I feel something looking up from the floor, dragging its breath through the stone, waiting for me to kneel again.
He arrived one foggy morning, wrapped in a coat of dark plum velvet, fingertips stained with oils and resins that no servant could name. He bowed low, too low, and when he rose, his eyes didn't meet hers. They lingered on her throat, then her wrists. "From the Emperor himself," he said, "a gift for your solitude and your scent." I remember the box, cedarwood with a silver clasp shaped like a serpent biting its tail. Inside were vials, 36 of them, each one a sin. Ambergris, musk from the Far East, a drop of crushed violet, a whisper of night-blooming jasmine, and something else, something I could never name. It clung to her skin long after the candles died, sweet at first, then bitter, almost metallic. He stayed for 3 days. No one knew where he slept, but every evening his shadow passed behind her curtains. They didn't speak much, only the language of hands and glass and breath. I watched from the keyhole once, just once. He was painting her spine, not with brush, but with perfume. Each vertebra a drop, each sigh a response. She never moaned. She whispered, like prayer, like punishment. When he left, he kissed the hem of her dress, left no scent behind, and never returned. But the bottles remained, and one by one they disappeared, not used, not emptied, vanished, until only one was left, the darkest vial,
sealed with black wax. She hasn't opened it. Not yet, but she keeps it close, right by her bedside, next to the candle and the dagger.
I should have left that night. I should have walked west, past the sleeping suits of armor, past the corridor with its scent of wax and roses, past the room where he still lay, silent, broken, beautiful. But I didn't, because when I saw her, outlined by the silver moon, bare as the night she was born, I knew something had changed. She wasn't mourning anymore. She was becoming. She stood with one hand on the stone windowsill, her skin catching the cold like porcelain left out too long. Her spine glistened faintly, a thin line of blood still drying between her shoulder blades. Not hers. He never touched her that deeply. Her voice came without turning. "You're still here." I swallowed. Yes. She let the word hang like smoke. "I thought you would be gone, like the others." I stepped closer. My boots didn't echo. The rug had been soaked in something thicker than wine. "Why did you stay?" she asked. And I didn't know how to answer. Because truthfully, I was terrified. Not of her violence, but of her silence, of her stillness, of how beautiful power could look when it stopped pretending to be grief. She turned, slowly, no modesty, no hesitation, just skin, moonlight, and the look of a woman who'd decided she would never again ask permission. He begged, not for his life, for a second chance to please me. I looked at her hands. There was no blood, only calm. "And I asked. Her smile curved, just slightly. She tried. Then she stepped closer, close enough that I felt the heat of her skin under the cold. She placed her hand against my chest, right above my heart. "Do you want to try too?" Her eyes locked mine, not lustful, not cruel, just curious, dangerous. And I realized it wasn't just death she dealt. It was the power to choose how it came. Slowly, softly, or not at all. And somewhere in the pit of my stomach, I felt it. Not fear, but surrender. To her, to this, to whatever came next.
I didn't expect her to turn to me, not while her fingers were still red, not while the girl's breath still lingered like a fragile fog between life and exhibition. She looked, really looked, into my eyes, as if sketching a question with her gaze before letting it fall to silence. "Would you paint this?" Her voice soft, like a lullaby laced with poison. I could have lied, said no, said I was only here for the crown, for the tapestries, for the myth of her. But I nodded, and she smiled. That smile, it could melt marble and carve cruelty into gold. She turned back to the girl, still breathing, still warm. Elizabeth didn't need to be cruel. That was the terrifying part. She could be gentle, almost maternal, as she covered the girl's wrist with silk, as she whispered something, not to her, but to herself. Something Latin, I think, or older. The room held its breath.
Even the fire stilled. Then she said, "Paint what you see, but only what's true." I should have asked, "True to whom?" But my hands had already moved, and she dipped her finger again, just once, into that crimson pool. She walked toward me, slow, deliberate steps. One bloody fingerprint, pressed gently to the edge of my canvas. "There," she said. "Now it's real." And God help me, it was.
She left the room in silence, but her scent lingered behind, amber, iron, and a touch of rose, like a garden after rain, if the rain had teeth. The girl on the table, still breathing, barely, shivered once beneath the silk. I hesitated, not out of mercy, out of fear that touching her might break the spell. I turned to the canvas instead, to the fingerprint. It bled slightly into the fibers, not a smudge, but a mark, a seal. I began to paint, not what I thought I saw, but what she wanted me to. Her posture perfect, the girl pale as candle wax, the red richer than rubies. Every stroke made me colder, as if some part of me dripped into the brush. I no longer felt my own hands. And then, a voice behind me, low, male. "She trusts you." I turned. A man stood at the threshold, half shadowed by the door. Black uniform, gloved hands, eyes like dried ink. "She doesn't trust many," he said, "especially those who watch too closely." I said nothing, because he wasn't really waiting for a reply. "She keeps them alive longer now." He stepped into the light. Not young, not old, just used. Not for kindness, he added, for clarity. Then without a sound, he turned and vanished down the hall like a ghost that had grown tired of haunting the same room. I stared at the door, at the canvas, at the blood. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which one of us was the real subject of the painting.
There are nights when the castle breathes differently. Not wind, not sound, but a hush that tastes like metal. That night was one of them. I was summoned again, long before the paint had dried. A servant I didn't recognize handed me a sealed letter. No words, just the wax crest, the wolf's head, her mark. The halls were empty, as if cleared for something sacred or unspeakable. At the tower's base, the guards didn't speak. They opened the iron gate like priests revealing a reliquary. And I descended alone. Stone stairs swallowed light, moisture licked the walls. Every step deeper felt like a step backward in time. Then I saw her. Elizabeth, seated on a low stone bench, barefoot, bare-shouldered, bare-eyed. No corset, no jewels, just a single chain wrapped twice around one wrist, more symbol than restraint. She smiled, but it didn't reach her throat. "There are things," she said, "that need to be remembered." Her fingers brushed the chain, but not forgiven. Behind her, a girl knelt, silent, motionless, with skin the color of old paper. I didn't ask who she was or why she wouldn't move.
Elizabeth gestured to the wall, and I understood. This time, she wanted me to paint without canvas, fresco, direct onto stone, an eternal confession for eyes that would never look away. I raised the chalk. My hand trembled. She noticed. "You can't flinch," she whispered, "not when you paint truth." And so I drew her, as she was that night, unchained, unchosen, undeniable. Each line carved into the chill of the wall, until even the shadows seemed to stare back.
She made me stay, long after the paint dried, long after the girl collapsed, quiet as a folded dress. The candles bled out, the walls breathed, and she stood slowly, like rising smoke. She walked toward the basin, marble, cold, stained with rust or memory. I wasn't sure which. She dipped her hands in, red, still warm, not paint this time. "Do you believe in ritual?" she asked, without turning. I lied. I said I didn't know, because belief is dangerous in her presence. She turned around, hands dripping, smiling like a cathedral about to burn. Then she touched my face, smudged blood on my cheek. A line, a mark, claimed, again. And I, stupid, trembling, said, "Thank you." She laughed, not cruel, not kind, just certain. Behind her, the girl was gone. Only the chain remained, still warm. Elizabeth stepped closer. Her breath tasted like wine and something older, a hunger aged in silence. "Paint me," she said, "but not as I am. Paint what I will become." I didn't ask. I never do. My brush followed the voice inside her eyes. And what I painted wasn't human. Not quite. A throne of vertebrae, a mouth of roses and knives, a woman dressed in crowns of her lover's teeth. She watched me paint it all, watched me invent her, or reveal her. And when I was done, she kissed my wrist, right where the pulse hides.
I woke up in that room before the sun dared to rise. Heavy velvet curtains still drawn shut from the night. No sound, no movement, only her breathing, slow, steady, like a cap full of blood. I didn't reach for my brush, didn't open the door. I just stared at her bare shoulder, a fresh scratch still glistening red on her back. I remembered the whispers from the maids last night. They said she never sleeps, just lies there, listening to dried blood in someone else's hair. I used to laugh. Now I keep quiet. Elizabeth turned slightly, didn't open her eyes, but her lips curled. "Last night, you saw me." I didn't deny it. She reached out, fingers thin like bird bones, still smeared with violet bruises. "Come closer," she said. Not a command, an invitation. I stepped in, kneeled by the bed. A silent ritual between two creatures no longer human. She pulled my hand to her belly, smooth, cold, like stone waiting to be carved. "Do you think I could create life from this guilty flesh?" I didn't answer.
I wasn't foolish enough to call her a woman. She was something else, something beyond species. She laughed, softly, like scissors slicing skin. Then she leaned in, whispered in my ear, "If I bear a child, will you paint it? Will you paint the eyes that know how to kill before they ever cry?" I didn't nod. I didn't retreat. I just breathed, like a man alive inside hell without knowing it.
They brought him in near dusk. A servant, young, barely grown. He held a tray with trembling hands, a bowl of warm milk, a folded cloth scented with rose. She had requested it. She always chose carefully. The boy didn't speak a word, but his eyes, they wandered too long at the door. He was curious. She noticed. She opened it herself. No guards, no veil, just a soft nod and the words, "Come in." Set it by the fire. Her tone, neither warm nor cold, just watchful. I stood further down the hall, close enough to hear the shift of fabric, the creak of the floor. Not much else. Time passed slowly that night. He came out before midnight, eyes down, face unreadable, like something had changed, but hadn't broken. She didn't call anyone else. She stayed in silence till morning, curtains drawn, fire low. Even her hounds lay quiet, sensing something different. When I saw her next, she looked younger somehow, less armored, but her voice was even. She asked for blue in her gown and a garden background for her portrait. She said, "Spring, but not too bright." I said nothing, as always, just painted what I could. Her gaze drifted elsewhere, to memory, maybe, or the sound of retreating footsteps she had already forgotten.
That morning, she asked for a mirror. Not the gilded ones from Vienna. No carvings, no angels. Just a small silver frame, tarnished along the edge. I brought it to her myself. No maids were summoned. She was still in her robe, hair loose, still damp at the ends. She looked unfinished, like a painting left too long in silence. She took the mirror in one hand, tilted it gently toward her face, and then away, toward her collarbone, then slowly down, but stopped. She frowned, then smiled, faintly. "What do they see in me?" she asked, not really asking. Power? Beauty? Or just the cage? I said nothing. That was safer. She liked silence more than lies. She turned to me, sharp, sudden. "You've watched, haven't you? You've seen what they become once I open the gate." Her voice wasn't cruel, just calm, like she already knew the answer. I didn't nod. I didn't blink. She laughed. Then she told me about the boy, how he lingered after curfew, how his fingers trembled even when she thought she was asleep. I let him stay. I gave him no orders, but he stayed. That was how it began. No chains, no commands, just the quiet pull of something he didn't understand. She didn't need to touch, she didn't need to demand. She waited until his gaze stopped trembling and started begging. She sipped her tea and asked for blue silk again. "No corset today. I want the wind to find me."
He wasn't the first, but he was the first who didn't flinch. She had asked him to brush her hair. Simple, soft. He stood behind her, silent, his fingers stiff around the ivory comb. "Slower," she murmured. "Pretend I'm glass." He tried. He was careful, but he was still clumsy. The comb caught a knot, ripped too fast. She gasped, not in pain, but something else. She stood so suddenly the comb clattered to the floor. He apologized. He bent to retrieve it. That's when she struck him. A slap? No, Not her style. She picked up the thin letter opener from the writing desk beside her. Silver, slender, cold as her morning bath. She didn't stab, just a slice along her collarbone, precise as a signature. He cried out, but didn't run, not even an inch. Blood welled up, red, vivid, too bright for the room. She touched it, then her lips, then his. The boy was shaking now, not from pain, but from something closer to awe. She whispered, "Still think I'm glass?" And he shook his head. That night, she kept the letter opener under her pillow.
She asked me to paint her one last time. Not in furs, not in armor, not in blood. Just her, as she had been at the beginning. Naked, pale, unblinking. The morning she summoned me, snow still clung to the window panes. Her chambers smelled of lilac and ashes. She was seated, not on the throne, not on the bed, but on the floor, legs folded, back straight, like a girl at prayer. "She paint me as they'll never see me," she whispered. "Paint the truth no one deserves." I asked what truth that was. She only smiled and parted her knees. I looked away, not from shame, but reverence. She laughed at that. "Even now you blush?" And I did. The brush trembled in my hand. Every stroke felt like betrayal, a slow undressing of her soul. And yet, she never looked more alive. We spoke little, but near the end, as I sketched her mouth, that cruel, beautiful mouth, she said, "They'll say I was a monster." Her voice was calm, almost tender. "And they'll be right." She leaned forward then, placed her hand over mine. "But monsters have hearts too." That was the last thing she ever told me. When I returned the next day, the fire had died, and so had she. Her body was cold, her skin blue as porcelain, and at her feet, the final painting, still wet, still trembling. I never showed it to the court. They wouldn't have understood. Because in that painting, she wasn't cruel. She wasn't a countess. She wasn't even human. She was eternal, like winter, like death, like desire that never dies. And I, the man who loved her in silence, I sealed the canvas and buried it beneath the chapel floor. Let them tell their stories. Let them chase her ghost. But I still see her. Each night, behind my eyelids, the Empress and her beasts.